What makes a man a father? I think about this all the time, since I am one now. I don't lean toward the spectacular in my answer. It's more a matter of tossing a football around, walking to the ice cream store, saying no, popping popcorn, reading a book aloud at night when we are all so tired that we are asleep long before the story ends. I think a person thinks about fathers, about being a father, more if he didn't have one. My father died when I was not yet one, in an automobile accident. For me, he's a void. My mother raised me, and she did not remarry, so I have always felt as if I did not have a father. All my life I've tried to fill that void. I see in the news other fatherless children trying to do the same, often with drugs, gangs, and violence. Unlike them, I know some facts about my father. He was a weatherman on television in Kansas City back in the early days of broadcasting, in the 1950s. He served in the war, World War II, in the Navy, and he graduated from college, the University of Illinois. He was a lieutenant, and his degree was a Bachelor in Science. Other than that, he's a blank. He was 31 when he died. He survived the war only to lose his life in a freak accident. A 58-year-old woman lost control of her car, possibly fell asleep, had a seizure, no one knows, and she swerved over the center line and hit my father's car head on. It was 9:30 at night, dark out. The roads were clear. My father was coming home from bowling. The woman and my father were both killed instantly. There was no alcohol involved. I've been told that a seatbelt or an airbag probably would have saved his life, but they didn't have those in the car he was driving. They weren't invented yet. Other people who had fathers when I was growing up seemed to take them for granted. I seized upon every scrap of information I could find about mine and saved everything he had owned or touched. A suit, a leather jacket, a pair of shoes, a Zippo lighter, a slide rule, a baseball glove, as if they were holy relics of a departed saint. I don't smoke, but I carry the lighter wherever I go. I keep it in working condition, full of fluid, with a good flint. I light it from time to time and meditate, I guess you could say, on the flame. The suit and the shoes are too small for me, but I wear the jacket occasionally, in the fall. The slide rule is in a leather case. His name is written on the outside of the case, his last name only, in ink, pressed deeply by his own hand, I presume, but it tells me little because it's in block lettering and it looks as if it had been stamped there by a machine. The baseball glove is very old-fashioned, flat, with no padding, a tiny web and a hole the size of a quarter worn through the palm. I sometimes used to put it on, but all I could feel was dry, cracked leather. My mother had some letters he had sent her when he was in the service, handwritten, including his signature, and she showed these to me, but I felt as if I was invading their privacy and looking at them. They were not meant for me. Of course, she had some pictures, too, black and whites. He was smiling, slim, and I was happy to have them, but my feeling in looking at them was that he could have been anybody. He was not someone I recognized, certainly not my father. I mean to say I could identify him, but I didn't know him. Growing up, I never cared much for my birthday. My mother did her best and would make me a cake and buy me presents, and I was grateful to her, and I needed her love, but it was my father's birthday that held the real attraction for me. Even though nothing special ever happened on my father's birthdays, they were always the most auspicious day in the year for me. I would think about him all day long, wonder what he was like, wonder what he thought when I was born. I can tell you what it was like, his birthday. It was like some great event had been scheduled, like the Super Bowl or an inauguration, and then for some reason it was called off, canceled, and a stillness, rather ominous, took its place. I don't believe in astrology, but I looked up his sign. He was a Cancer. It's a feminine sign, a water sign, the book said, and for a man that would indicate someone who provided for a family, who took tender care of his children. I read that about his sign, and I feel as if I was robbed, not just of his life, but of his destiny, and I was robbed of my father. My father had been an only child. Having no siblings, he was the last branch on the family tree, except for me, also an only child, who became that final branch when he died. I've had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and I believe they are good kids. My wife and I have done our best to raise them, but I've always been very insecure in my performance as a father, because I had no role to copy. I would wonder, am I doing the right thing? I would never answer the question, what would my father have done? I could never answer the question, what would my father have done? In a way, I felt as if I were an outsider in the family, an extra piece in the set. My father was a shadow figure, a ghost who haunted me, but unlike Hamlet's father, he never visited. I saw a documentary movie once about the Vietnam War Memorial, the wall with the names on it in Washington. There were many touching scenes in it, but one of them struck me in particular. It showed a woman taping a note to the wall, and the note read, "At last, after 26 years, I've found you. I love you, Dad." I felt the sadness of it, but I was also jealous. It was the same when I'd hear about an adopted child who located their birth parents after many years of searching. That kind of quest, for me, was pointless. The books I've read about adoption talked about genealogical bewilderment and hereditary ghosts and the confused genetic ego. For me, that translated to lost souls, and despite my mother's best efforts, I have lived with that feeling. But I'm lucky. It helps to know that my father loved me, even though I was never able to love him back. I've been out to where my father is buried many times, but I can't say I've ever felt his presence there. As a matter of fact, when I go there, my sense of loneliness intensifies. I think if you die in the service of some great cause, you can live on in the spirit of that cause, in some memorial. But if you're killed like my father was, in an accident, pure happenstance, then the thread is cut and there's nothing left to connect you. I find my father's grave a forbidding place. I have been there seeking comfort, but I no longer go. It's a sign for me only that he is truly gone, was taken away. One day I sent a letter to the television station where my father had worked, asking them if they had any footage of him reporting the weather. I told them I'd be glad to pay a fee if they could find some old film of him in their archives, if they had any archives. A few weeks later, a package arrived from the TV station. They had found some film of my father reporting the weather and had transcribed it onto videotape for me, free of charge. My hand shook as I held the package. I was actually a bit lightheaded. I tore off the wrapping. It was something to hold that little black plastic rectangle and to know it contained, in a sense, my father, or a trace of him at least. I put the tape in our VCR and hit play. I'm aware that we're known as the TV generation, the first kids who grew up in front of the tube like it was some kind of nanny or babysitter. But it was weird, very unreal to see my father appear on the screen, to know that man, younger than me, was my father. I really did, to say, "Hi, Dad." I touched the screen, but it was hard and cold, and I could not reach him. He was talking about the day's weather, of course, but I didn't listen to his words. I only concentrated on the way he looked and moved and spoke. I mean that apparition on the screen that was him. He was thin, with close-cut dark hair, almost a brush cut. He was wearing a dark suit and tie, a narrow tie. He looked a little like what people today would call a nerd. He looked so young. I liked the sound of his voice. It was deep and deliberate, though it was also somewhat distant and hollow, due, I suppose, to the age of the recording, or the way it had been recording over 40 years before, with the primitive equipment of those days. I played the tape over and over. It was only about 2 minutes long. The set was laughably spare by today's standards. My father was holding a wooden pointer, and he was standing before a large map of the United States. He sounded knowledgeable. At one point he said, "It's actually raining out right now, but the atmosphere is so dry that the rain is evaporating before it can hit the ground." He reminded me of a school teacher. America was covered with an array of stuck-on clouds and suns. Everything in the picture was black, white, or gray. My father gave the day's present temperature, 66 degrees, the day's high and low, the barometric pressure, and his prediction for tomorrow. Partly cloudy, high of 74, a good chance of a shower. I could see in him my dark hair, my nose and chin, my height and thinness, my fondness for facts, accuracy and logic, and an optimism, that good chance of, that I didn't possess. He is a bit formal in his presentation. I'm sure he thought of that as being professional. He is, after all, trying to convey information, not entertain. He is friendly, I think, but not cheerful or overtly upbeat like the modern run of ebullient meteorologists. I showed the tape to my kid. "That's your grandfather," I told them, but they didn't have much reaction. How could they? He doesn't look like a grandfather, or behave like one either. The tiny fragment of activity on the tape isn't enough to qualify him as a full-fledged granddad. My wife is happy for me that I got the tape and could see my father, but that's all it means to her. So I'm the only one who watches the tape. I'm slightly in awe of it. I hope it doesn't come across as sounding too silly. It is my father to me, the closest I will ever come to him. I try to find him there when I watch it. It's not as intimate as I would like, but it's all I've got, and I'm grateful for it. I can almost pretend that he's talking just to me. I treat it as a kind of message. I study it for clues. He sticks to the facts. He doesn't get personal. I'm not foolish enough to believe that there are any hidden meanings in what he has to say. He means exactly what he says, and he says the same thing every time, and he looks exactly the same way every time. It's eerie. It's like he's stuck in time, like the old Twilight Zone TV show. By the way, he looks a little like Rod Serling did, if you have ever seen him. It's like the TV is some kind of suspended animation chamber, and if I turn it on, there he is, greeting me over a vast chasm of time and space. What do they call it? A time warp? If it were an episode of The Twilight Zone, he might somehow come alive on the tape and stop doing the weather and talk to me. "Hello, son, I'm your dad," which would be so wonderful. But this isn't a work of anyone's imagination. It's real, on the TV, in my living room, and he sticks to his report. Something of that image reminds me of Superman's father, Jor-El. I read the comics when I was a kid, comics along with TV. Jor-El sent his son far away and enclosed the whole story of what happened to the planet Krypton and who he was and why he'd been sent to Earth. Superman watched all of this. The comics would have a special issue featuring the origins of Superman in the fortress of solitude he built for himself. It was important for him to know where he'd come from. His secret identity was Superman, and his name was Clark Kent, but his real name was Kal-El. The whole concept of identity was very complicated for him. I know it is this way between fathers and sons, going all the way back to Oedipus. He is another one who learned about his origins only after he was grown. Oedipus and Superman are really pretty similar, except one discovered bad news, a hideous fate, while the other found sadness, but also something he could be proud of, a legacy and a purpose. And what have I found? I watched the tape of my father in our living room. I'm not sure what it tells me about my origins. Probably nothing. It's like the letters to my mother, or the printing on the slide rule case, the flame of the Zippo, the antique baseball mitt, the suit and the shoes no one will ever wear. I do feel as if I am alone when I watch it, as if I'm looking at a person and a way of life I can never return to, not even with all my advanced powers and abilities. I'm stuck where I am in a way, like he is. It's an unbridgeable chasm, and yet I see him there, my father, on the other side. I can't tell you how strange that makes me feel. I watch the tape occasionally for various reasons, sometimes for no reason at all, just to keep in touch, I guess, with him and with myself. It's that old curiosity, and proving to myself that I did have a father. He was real, there he is, providing an analysis of the weather situation for the people of Kansas City, performing a valuable service, I think. Quite a lot depended on the weather. People wanted to know. The rest of the news and sports was about what had already happened. My father was telling his viewers about the future. He was a forecaster. It was dry. They needed him. I called the station, thanked them for sending the tape, and asked if they could tell me the exact date of the broadcast. Then I called the public library in Kansas City and asked if someone could please find a copy of the Kansas City Star for the next day. I asked them if it had rained on that day. They said it had. I thanked them and hung up. I had learned something else about my dad. See how lucky I turned out to be? He was accurate. He could be trusted. He did not make false promises. And one day I showed the tape to a friend, and I said, "This is my dad."